So I recently asked which flower you'd like to see me make next. And without a shadow of a doubt, this one was the most popular. So the flower that we're going to be making today is an anemone, and I'm using heavyweight German crepe paper for that. So I'll put all of the details in the description box below for all of the materials and colours that I'm using today. Now, obviously anemones come in all sorts of different colours in nature. So a lot of times you'll see the white with the black centre, but I wanted to do something a bit more colourful today. So we're going with a purple, which is a little bit more unusual. I'll also have some more videos coming soon showing you different colour combinations, as well as the techniques that I've used to create those. And I've focused those on the purple base, but obviously with more variety as well. So keep an eye out for those coming soon. You'll need a template, which is available for free from my website, which is tarmuchlypaperblooms.com. And I'll pop a link in the description box that you can go there and download it. So you'll get access to this template. This is the cut by hand version. If you download the cut by hand version, you'll get this, plus a materials list that you'll need. And if you download the cut by machine option, you'll get a copy of that just for reference. And then you'll also get the SVG files, which you program into your cutting machine. So the first thing you need to do is to transfer your template onto cardstock. Now, if your printer will print directly onto cardstock, you can just print it direct, but most don't. So if that is the case with you, print it out onto normal paper and then cut around the templates and then trace around those onto cardstock. Make sure that when you're transferring them, you put the 3 little lines on there as well, because that's going to tell you which direction the paper needs to be in. Next, we're going to gather all of our materials. So I'll put links to all of these in the description box below. So first of all, you'll want some crepe paper for the main petals. So I'm using this purple. You'll also want a green for the leaves and also for the stem. And then for the centre, you'll also want some black. This crepe paper that I'm using is the heavyweight German and it's the Lia Griffith range. You'll need a wire for your stem, so something like a 16 or an 18 gauge will work well for this. This one is 18 inches long, but you can have that the length that you want your flower to be. You'll want some tacky glue, and I really like the Aleene's tacky glue. So I like to decant my tacky glue into a little pot, and I use a cocktail stick to apply that. And what that does is makes it even more tacky, so it's easier to work with. Stops your paper sliding around as much, and it dries a lot quicker as well. And then just a toothpick or cocktail stick to apply that with. You'll need a ruler or a measuring tape. You'll need some scissors, and I highly recommend you get these sort with the pointed tip. It doesn't need to be the specific brand, but something that's got a pointed tip that cuts right to the end. And then the spring action on the scissors is really good to help stop any pain from repetitive cutting. You'll need some pliers, just normal household pliers will do. You just need to cut your wire with that. And then you'll also need a big paintbrush. I like this fluffy one. It's just an artist's brush and some Mod Podge. I recommend you get the matte finish Mod Podge, but if you only have the gloss, that will also work. And then you'll also need something to protect your workspace. I like to use cling film. It's also known as cling wrap or kitchen wrap in different parts of the world. And I find it works really well for protecting your workspace from Mod Podge or inks or anything like that. Okay, so the first bit we're going to work on is the centre of the flower. So that's this area here. Now you can see it's made up of a black centre, then a black fringe, and then there's an additional fringe which is purple with the black detail on the edge. So that outer ring is actually an iconic part of an anemone. So you can actually have a little bit of fun with that as well if you want to mix the colours up. So that would be quite a good one if you had multiple shades. So maybe if you had a lighter purple and a darker purple, you could do that in maybe the dark, and that will give you a nice contrast, or you can do as I've done here with the same colour. So I would tend to keep the outer edges and also this inner circle in the black, unless it's a specific flower that you're trying to replicate. So if you've seen one in nature that's a different colour, that's obviously different, but that black gives it a really nice contrast and also tends to be the one that you see most in nature. So you can trim the length of your wire down so that it's the height that you want your flower to be. You'll probably have a piece of wire left over if you do that. So just keep hold of that because we can either use that later on. It's quite good for curling the petals with, or you'll probably find you can use it in another project as well. So next we're going to cut the black crepe paper for the centre. So first of all, we're going to stretch out the crepe paper and we're going to use this fully stretched. So you'll see on the crepe paper there are some grain lines and we need to make sure they're running top to bottom as opposed to left to right. so that we can stretch out the paper all the way. So to stretch the paper, all you need to do is grasp it between both hands. So I find it easier if you have both hands on either side of the paper with your thumbs on the front and then resting your fingers on the back. And then you can literally just grip the paper tightly and then stretch it apart as much as you can. Don't worry too much about ripping the paper. This is usually pretty sturdy paper. It is possible to rip it, but it won't rip as easily as you expect it to. So you can just grip with your hands and then stretch this all the way out. So then we're going to cut out some pieces of paper to make the ball center. So I'm going to give you the exact sizes of paper that I'm using here, and then that will give you the same size center as I have. However, this doesn't need to be too precise. So if you do have slightly different sizes of paper, don't worry about it too much. So we're going to start by covering the strip of paper with some tacky glue. So this is the 3 by 1 inch strip, and then you just want to put a layer of tacky glue over that full strip. As you can see, I've decanted some of my glue into that little pot that we talked about before, and I'm using a cocktail stick to apply it. And then I found the easiest way to create the starting point for this ball is just to fold it in on itself. So you just want some kind of blob in a nutshell that you're going to cover anyway. So you just need to keep folding that in on itself until you've got like a flat squashed ball. And then once you have that, just roll it between the palm of your hands until it forms more of a ball shape. And then we're going to add another layer of paper over the top of that. So again, we're just going to cover it with the glue. This is starting with the smallest square, which is 1.5 by 1.5 inches square. And once you have that covered in glue, you put that ball that we made before into the center and then wrap it around. You might need to stretch and fold it over. And then once you have that all stuck down, again, just roll it between the palms of your hands until you get a ball shape. And then we're going to repeat that whole process for the 2 by 2 inch square. And if you're left with a little piece that's sticking up with no glue on, you can just add a little extra glue there. And then we're going to repeat that again for the following 3 pieces of paper. So this is the 2.5 by 2.5 inch pieces. So for this outer layer, if you're left with any bits of glue on there, you can just scrape those off, and I just use the end of my scissors to do that. And actually only one side of the ball is going to be visible anyway, so just choose the side that's the smoothest with the least amount of glue on it, and that's going to be the top. So once you have that, turn the ball over so that you're basically looking at the bottom of the ball, and that's where we're going to make the hole for the stem to go in. So you can actually do this with your scissors if you feel comfortable. Obviously, please be careful that you don't stab yourself in the process. But generally I find using my scissors and I just open them up and use one of the blades. That's usually the easiest way of doing this. And then just push the scissors in to about 3/4 of the way in. Then dip the end of your wire into the tacky glue. Make sure you have a generous amount of glue and then push that into the ball. Really important thing to note there is that you really need to do this while the glue is still wet. If the glue has started to dry or has fully dried, it's going to be very difficult to create that hole. So I recommend that you do this immediately after you create the ball center. And also that really helps because then now when we put the wire and the glue in there, we can set that to one side and let it dry while we're working on the rest of the flower. So next up, we're going to work on the inner fringe. So for this, you want a piece of crepe paper that's fully stretched out, which is 4 inches wide by 1.25 inches tall and with the grain lines top to bottom. If you're left with a little piece at the end that hasn't quite fully stretched, then you can just trim that off. So a little tip for cutting your crepe if you want to make sure that that's the same height all the way along. If you fold it into half and then half again so you create quarters, make sure you line up one edge. You can just tap that on your finger to do that. And then trim the end off there. That generally will give you a straight line all the way across. So then what we're going to do is to create a fringe from this piece of paper. So you can cut each individual bit of fringe along the length of the paper if you prefer. However, it's much quicker if you fold the paper over. So all you need to do is fold that into 4. So if you've just trimmed down the height, you actually don't need to unfold it. And then you need to put a slit into the ends of the paper where the folds are, and we're going to do these to just over halfway. And make sure when you're doing this that you firmly grip the paper between your thumb and your finger so that it doesn't slide around. And then you need to just work your way along the paper, cutting really small slithers of paper. The smaller you can do this, the better. It's going to look a lot more realistic if it's very fine. It does take a little bit of practice to get used to doing a fine fringe though. The more you do it, the quicker you get at it, and also the finer your fringe will be. But if your fringe looks a little bit fatter than this right now, I recommend you take some scrap paper and just practice on that first. So like I say, the finer the fringe, the better. So just take your time and practice getting as close as you can to the previous cut with your scissors. And then I like to open up the fringe and just check that I'm happy with it all. If there's any pieces that you've missed or that are a little bit fatter than you'd like, just go back in with the scissors and trim those as well. And then we're going to add a curl onto the fringe. So the idea is that this will curl in towards the centre of the ball. So I find the best way to do this is to curl it around my scissors. So in the same way as you'd curl ribbon, you just need to grip tightly on the solid end of the paper and then curl that between your finger and your thumb. You can also, as well as using scissors, you could also use the offcut of wire that we had earlier or a cocktail stick. Personally, I prefer using the scissors. I just find them easier to work with. It doesn't really matter what you use for this, it's just to get that curl so that it curls into the centre of the ball. And then we're going to add a line of glue along the inside edge. So just to make sure that that is on the right side, you can wrap that round to make sure it curls in, and so the glue will be on the inside. Next up, we're going to attach that to the ball centre. So you just need to line up the bottom of the paper with the bottom of the ball. So there'll be a slight overlap from where the paper is to where the wire joins the ball, and that will like cover it slightly. So that works as quite a nice guide so you know where to put it. And then you just need to work your way around, wrapping the paper around the ball centre, keeping that lined up at the bottom as best you can. You will need to fold the paper a little bit, there'll be a few creases you need to add in, and just pinch the bottom to make sure it's all stuck. Whilst this is still wet, you can manipulate the position of the paper a little bit, so you can push that down and just make sure it's all firmly attached. Now I will add at this point, if the ball centre you used is a slightly different size to what I used, the height of this fringe might not sit quite right. So if that is the case, you just need to adjust it so that the fringe sits above the top of the ball, but it doesn't sit too high, like you can still see the ball centre. And there's maybe like 1/4 of an inch above the top of the ball to the top of the fringe. For the outer fringe, we're going to laminate 2 strips of crepe together. So that basically means we're going to glue them together and then trim them down so that they act as one piece of crepe paper. So we're going to have a strip of black and a strip of purple, both fully stretched. And we want the black to be slightly wider than the purple. So the black is actually taller than we need it to be, but it's very difficult to work with when it's any smaller. So if you do feel comfortable doing this smaller, then great, but if not, start with a small piece, which is about maybe 1/4 of an inch, and fold that over all the way across. Then once you have that, take the other edge and then fold that back on itself. So you're basically folding it into 3. And I highly recommend you do this step first before you add any glue, because it gets very, very fiddly once you add the glue. And then just run your fingers all the way across that. Make sure that you've got some nice crisp edges to work with, because that's going to help make your life easier. Now, as I say, if you can do this smaller, your flower will look more realistic. The smaller you can get it, the better. However, as I say, it does get very fiddly, so this size works great. So once we have the folded edge to use as our guide, we're then going to unfold the paper and add a thin line of glue all the way across. And then you can then fold that piece of paper back down to seal that. So you can lay the paper flat with the inside face up and then add another layer of glue to that. And then we're going to take the purple that we cut previously, and you want to line up the edge of the purple strip with the edge of the fold of the paper that you did before. So it doesn't have to be perfect. The paper does actually tend to bend and warp a little bit because it's got so much glue on it. But if you can get it approximately right, that edge that we folded works as a really nice guide to work to. So then you're going to get about an equal black line across the top of your purple. As I say, it doesn't need to be perfect, and if it's not, you will not tell when the flower is finished. It's just as a guide to work to. And then work your way along, folding that top piece, keeping as close to the edge as you can. So you'll see as I'm working here, there's a little bit that has moved slightly up. So I'm going to try and adjust that so it kind of sits in line, but it doesn't matter too much. So take your time with this because, like I say, the paper stretches and moves quite a bit when it's got the wet glue on it. But you're creating a black line at the top of the purple on both sides. So obviously one side is going to be thicker than the other because we've got 2 sheets of paper on one side and only one on the other side. That doesn't matter. It's just about creating a little bit of thickness and this black edge on the purple. And then just to finish it off, run your fingers across that edge to make sure it's all stuck down, and then stretch out both sheets of paper together as one, just to make it flat. Okay, so now we're going to focus on our petals. So you can see there's a few different sizes. There's actually 5 different petal shapes and sizes, which are included in the template. So there's this tiny little one here at the front and then bigger ones at the back as well. So we're going to start by cutting out the crepe. So make sure you're working with the grain lines running top to bottom, and then stretch out the paper all the way. And then take your template, and we want to make sure that the template lines up with the grain lines on the paper. So you'll see on the template there's 3 little lines. That indicates the direction of the grain in the paper. So it's really important that when you're cutting those out, you follow that direction so that the paper stretches in the right way. So you can go ahead and cut out all of your petals from the template. You'll see the quantities that you need are listed at the top in the purple band. You can cut these all individually if you want to do one at a time, or you can fold the paper over like I'm doing here to speed things up a little bit and do a few at once. Now you might see there's a few bits that don't quite cut as well if you do that, so just go back in and trim those down when you're finished. And then go ahead and cut out all of the petals in one go here. So now we're going to come back to the fringe that we did before. Now you do need to make sure this is fully dry before you do this next step. So if you can leave it overnight, that's great, but certainly for at least a few hours. And then what we're going to do is just neaten up these edges to make sure that they line up. So you can just trim those down with your scissors. And the next step is going to be to make the fringe. So to do the fringe, we're going to do lots of very small scissor cuts. So the closer together you can get your cuts, the more realistic your flower will be. So take your time. I'm obviously speeding up the video here, but also bear in mind I do this quite frequently. So I'm a lot faster now than I was when I first started. So please don't be deterred by how fast this looks on screen. Take your time with it and try and get those scissor cuts right next to one another if you can. You want to leave about 1 centimetre-ish, maybe like 1/2 inch towards the bottom end, which is solid with no cuts in it. And that's what we're going to use to attach the fringe to the flower. Now, normally I would speed this up by folding the paper over so I can cut multiple layers at a time, but because we've already got folded paper on there that's thicker, that's a bit too fiddly here. So once we've done that, we're going to twist all of the fringe segments. So what we're trying to do here is rub each of the pieces between our fingers and thumbs to remove that flat edge. So you want that to be more rounded if you can. And this is where making the scissor cuts really close together really helps, because if you've got a chunky bit here, then it's quite hard to get that to twist, whereas the small thin slithers will be a lot easier to twist together. So you can see I'm doing quite a few in one go. If you prefer, you can do them individually. It doesn't make any difference. It's just going to take a lot longer. So if you can, get a few of the pieces between your fingers and then just rub those together. Do the same on the next batch, and you can always go back in and do any that you've missed or that didn't quite twist properly as well. Next, we're going to attach this onto the stem. So run a layer of glue along that solid bottom edge that we didn't cut beforehand. And then you want to line that up with the bottom of the black ball that we made previously. So get that as close to the stem itself as you can. You need to then wrap that around, and it should wrap around a couple of times here. And as you're working, make sure that you pinch the bottom of the purple paper so that it attaches to the underside of the ball. You don't want the bottom edge to stay as a straight edge. You want that to kind of tuck in and stick down. And that's going to help it adhere to the actual stem itself, but also give you the shape that you need for the flower. So you can just pinch that with your fingers just to get it to stick. You might need to work into it a few times to get that right, but just keep pressing on that with your fingers until it attaches fully. So you can see here the paper has wrapped around about twice around the black centre. And then just go back in with your fingers and spread that fringe out so that it sits roughly right. You can obviously adjust this later as well, but this is just to kind of give a rough idea of what it's going to look like. This is a good point. If you see any flat pieces of fringe that are a bit too chunky, you can also go back in and trim them or twist them if you need to, just to make them more realistic. This next step is where the flower really comes to life. So we're going to shape all of the petals in one go, and you can use a cocktail stick or a piece of wire to do this if you prefer. Personally, I prefer to use my scissors, and I like to bend the paper between the blade of the scissors and my thumb. So obviously, please be careful if you are using scissors to do this. My scissors have a little lock on them, which locks them in position. So if you have that, I do recommend you put that on. So what we want to do is curl the petal away from you. So you're curling it underneath. So you can do that in two ways. It's best to vary it a little bit. So for the first few that you do, I suggest you doing like a reverse V shape. So you want to kind of curl on 2 points. So you're taking an angle on one side on the right and then do the same on the left. And then do that with some more of the petals. But then to create some variety, do more curls as you work around. So you might do 3 or 4 different angles around the edge of the paper instead. As you're doing this, also push down with your thumb in the centre of the petal, and that's going to create a slight little indent, which helps to give the petal more shape as well. You can also make these more lifelike. So the ones that have the little nicks taken out of them, just flip those over and then curl them. And that's going to give you variety in the petals so that they don't all look the same. So you're going to have a few more different shapes without having to actually cut any more shapes out. You also, as you're doing this, want to bend the little tab at the bottom so that that bends away as well. So if you imagine how that's going to be attached to the flower, we're going to put the glue onto the tab, and that is the piece that will stick. So you want the whole petal, once that's stuck, to bend away from the flower then. And then when you get to the end, I suggest you do 1 or 2 petals which bend in the opposite direction. And that's just going to give you a little bit more flow in the flower and make it look a bit more lifelike. You don't want to do very many like that because it won't be the right shape for this particular flower. But 1 or 2 where you have the main bend away from the flower, but then maybe part of the petal that bends up and in instead, that's really going to make it look more realistic. You can then add glue to all of the tabs like we talked about before. So you want to fully cover the tab. You need a reasonable amount of glue here to make sure it holds, but don't go beyond the tab. Make sure that full petal is exposed. And then start with the smallest petals and work your way around adding those onto the bottom of the fringe centre that we did before. So if you watch where I'm placing these on camera, it's roughly about halfway up to start with. Ideally, you want the top of the tab, so where we have that bend, to line up with the kind of the start of the top of the curve of the ball. And then the way I'm attaching these here, like I said, I'm starting with the smallest, and then I'm taking the next size up, and I'm working round so that I have these at, like, if you think of a clock, so at 12, 3, 6, and 9. And I have the smallest next to the third size up. So I have 1 small, and then I have 2 of the next size, and then the 4th petal is the size up again. And having them positioned like that also helps to make it look more realistic. If you just did them opposite, they don't look as lifelike. So those first 4 petals are like the first layer. And then beyond that, we're going to add another layer which sits behind. So we're going to add these petals that fill the gaps in. So you're going to create this overlap as well. As you're attaching these, try and work down so that they sit lower down on the bottom of the flower. So we're covering up what we've just attached to kind of give a neater finish. So you'll see here I'm covering each of the gaps, but the critical thing to do here is to keep turning the flower over so that you look at the front of it, so that you can then see where any gaps are or where more petals need to sit. So you want to make sure that you're not putting too many petals on one side, that it's making it a nice rounded flower. As you're attaching each of the petals, also make sure that you pinch the base so that you can make sure that they're really well stuck. Okay, next up it is the stem. Now you will probably have noticed that I'm not using a floral tape for this, and that is intentional, and there's two reasons for that. First of all, a lot of people have said to me recently that they're struggling to find good quality floral tape. So I wanted to give you an alternative option to that. So there are obviously lots of floral tapes available worldwide and obviously different qualities. Personally, the ones that I found have been the best quality have been imported from the States, and occasionally I'm able to get other ones from within Canada. But generally the supply is a bit hit and miss. So you may be experiencing a similar thing. I know people in the UK and also in New Zealand have been struggling to find some. So if you are struggling, then this is a good option for any of the flowers, really. It doesn't have to be just this one. This is a good way of avoiding floral tape if you want. The other thing is, I actually really like how it looks. There's two aspects to that. So first of all, this stem needs to be thicker because the type of flower that it is doesn't have a very thin, spindly wire type stem in nature. It's quite thick and solid. So it's great from an aesthetic point of view because it looks more natural. The other thing is the colours that are available. Like floral tape's only available in a certain number of colours. There's not much choice. You're kind of limited to what you can get. And that also means if you want your flower to look realistic, you need to use the same colour for your leaves so that it all matches. If you've got a different colour leaf to your stem, it's going to look really strange unless you've got some kind of transition detail. So that's extra work if you want to add painted details or pan pastels or anything like that. This is a great way of doing it that you don't have to worry about that. So it's actually ticking a lot of boxes, and to be honest, I think I'm going to start using this method in all of my flowers because I don't really see the need to have the floral tape except that it's slightly quicker, but the finished effect is not as good. So I think I'd rather spend a little bit of extra time and do it this way. Now, obviously, if you do like using floral tape, you can continue with that. Don't worry, you can still do this flower with that. Just try and make sure that your leaf colour and your floral tape are the same or as close as possible. All you need to do for this stage is to cut strips of crepe paper in any colour, whatever you have lying around, whatever scraps of crepe you have. This is a great way of using them up. So you want your crepe paper to be fully stretched and keep them to smallish strips so that they're quite manageable. There's no specific size on this, it's just whatever you find more manageable. So here you can see the difference between the basic wire and the finished stem. So obviously the finished stem is quite a bit thicker. So you're just going to keep adding these strips to your stem until you get the right thickness. So you want something that looks about this thick. And the easiest way to do it is to work in small batches, cover each strip with glue and then just wrap that around the stem. So you can either wrap around one specific area and get that to the right thickness, or what I prefer to do is to wrap a little bit around each part of the stem and then make sure that's as even as possible, and then I'll just keep adding more thickness until it's as thick as I want it to be. But just work your way around this, building up the layers until you're happy with it. The last step is then to add a layer of the green so that you have the finished colour. When you get to the top of the stem, you can also cover the base of the flower if you want to hide any messy edges. So if when you've attached your petals, they're quite neat and they overlap onto the wire, you don't need to do this stage. But if you find that you can see where the petal ends or it's a little bit messy, then you can just cover up those edges with the bit of the green here. So this is just like a nice easy technique to hide some of that. While the glue is still wet, we're going to add a slight bend about 2 inches down from the base of the flower. Just a small bend in there so that it sits at the right angle, but it's a lot easier to do that now while the glue is wet than once it's dry. Okay, and then the last step is the leaves. So with the anemone, the leaves tend to curl up and then bend right back down again. So there's quite a harsh bend on the leaves. So obviously these leaves are quite detailed, there's lots of cuts on there. And to create that without any additional support is going to be very difficult because your leaves will be very flimsy. So if you just used fully stretched out crepe paper and cut this detail in, you're going to struggle to get this curve. But even if you did get the curve, it's not going to stay because it's very flimsy and thin and it's going to be difficult to cut. So with this one, I highly recommend that you use Mod Podge on your leaves. What we're going to do is paint the leaves with Mod Podge first. So before we cut them out, we're going to paint our green paper with Mod Podge. So you can actually do either both sides of the paper or just one side. And that really depends on how much time you have and also what finish look you're trying to go for. So personally, I think it looks a lot better if you do both sides with the Mod Podge. What happens when you curl it once it's dry is it kind of stretches out and puts like a weird film on one side. If you do both sides of the paper, it doesn't tend to do that as much. So personally, I always try and do both sides. I'll show you an example which has them both side by side so you can make that decision for yourself. So protect your workspace with some cling wrap, and then cut out some squares of crepe to match the size of the leaf templates. And then we're literally just going to use a fluffy brush and brush the glue all over the paper. Just make sure that every bit of the paper is covered and that it's quite an even spread of glue. Once that's dry, you can peel it up from the cling wrap, and if you're going to do both sides, turn it over and redo the other side. And then once we've painted the Mod Podge onto the paper, let that dry. We're then going to cut the leaves out from that. And because it's got that rigidity to the paper, it's going to be a lot more sturdy. And you can see these don't really move too much. Like I can poke and prod them and it's totally fine. And they're going to keep their shape and be a lot more durable. Using the templates, go ahead and cut out the leaf shapes from the paper that we just glued. A little tip when you're doing this, I find it helps to cut away from yourself. So because we've got these sharp points on the leaves, it's easier to cut away and to just do little snips rather than having to turn the paper around too much. So you'll see here I'm cutting into the V rather than away from the V. Another point here is, whilst I would normally recommend you cut more than one petal or leaf at a time, so folding the paper over to speed up the process, it's quite difficult to do that with this now the paper is glued, so just do one at a time. Then we're going to add a bend onto all of our leaves. So this is the exact same technique as we did with the petals. So you just want to bend those so that the leaf curls away from the stem. Once all your leaves are curled, then you can add the glue. And we're just going to add glue to the bottom section of the leaf, so almost where the tab is at the bottom. And then what we're going to do is stagger the leaves. So they're going to be at random intervals. They're not any set positioning. So what we'll do is put one layer around the top and then we'll go slightly lower down and offset them so they fill the gaps. So it looks a lot more natural if you do a random offset as opposed to me saying, right, they're at 90-degree angles or anything like that. So we're going to do them quite randomly, but filling in any gaps so that it looks a lot more filled and less sparse. So the first leaf that we attach will sit just below the bend that we did to the stem before. And then, like I say, we're going to add the next ones more randomly so that it looks more natural. So add another 2 at the same height. Make sure that you pinch those quite a bit as you're attaching them so that the glue has time to get a hold of that. And then for the layer that's going to sit underneath those leaves, we're also going to have 2 small strips of green crepe that's fully stretched and covered in glue. And that's going to help us just attach the leaves and make sure everything's well stuck down, as well as making it look a lot neater. So underneath the first layer, add a strip of the green. So that's going to trap in all of the base of the leaves to make sure they're well stuck down. And then we're going to go slightly lower with our second layer of leaves, trying to fill in the gaps that we created before. And then once those are attached, we're going to add another layer of green just to make sure that's all well stuck down. So that's it. So I hope you found that useful and that you have a beautiful paper anemone. I'd love to see how it turned out, and if you make a whole bunch of them, that'd be great to see those too. If you'd like to share, then you can either tag me on Instagram, I'm at tarmuchley_paperblooms, or you can email them to me, which is blooms@tarmuchley.com. So I am in the process in adding more things to my website, which includes a gallery featuring each of the flowers made using my templates. So if you would like to be featured in that, then please do send me one of your images and just let me know, because it's great to see how they turn out and to also inspire other budding paper florists. I am working on new templates all the time. I have about 5 or 6 on the go currently that I'm working on a little bit here and there to find the one that I'm really happy with. I am a bit of a perfectionist, so I don't release them until I'm completely happy. So if you watch one of my recent videos, you'll know that I have quite a few that I've just held back because they're not perfect. So hopefully I will be refining those soon for you. And also I'm in the process of working on new designs too. So I do have a voting system available on my website, tarmuchleepaperblooms.com, where you can actually cast your vote for which paper flower I make next. So you can either choose some of the ones that are already there or make your own suggestion. And I do base my next designs on feedback from you guys. So if there is something you want to see, then just let me know. Also, do make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video goes live. Hopefully I'll see you again soon. Until then, happy flower making.